planning and crisis, and when technology fails, a manual for self-reliance. And he joins us now to talk about the real and present danger of a massive nuclear meltdown, a nuclear Armageddon. And Stein writes in a recent paper published on the internet, imagine what havoc it would wreak on our civilization and the planet's ecosystems if we were to suddenly witness not just 1 or 2 nuclear meltdowns, but 400 or more. I can venture to say that unless we take significant protective measures, this apocalyptic scenario is not only possible, but probable. Well, it's good to have you with us today, Mr. Stein. We appreciate you joining the program, and we definitely appreciate your books and your latest article. It's titled 400 Chernobyls, Solar Flares, EMP, and Nuclear Armageddon. And I was wondering if you could do us a favor and kind of break down the best you can what you put down in this article.
Sure, I'll try to give it to you in a nutshell. Well, it turns out that the sun burps several times a year. It's called a coronal mass ejection, and the sun basically launches a big mass of hot plasma, kind of sun stuff, out into space, and it goes really fast, like 1,000 times faster than our rockets fly. And most of the time it goes out into space harmlessly and nowhere near the Earth, no problem. And every now and then it goes out towards the Earth. Well, we had a big solar storm about 2 weeks ago. Incredible northern lights lit up the skies. They had to reroute some flights over the North Pole, but it was no big deal. Well, it turns out that, on the average, every 75, 100 years, something like that, it's kind of a crap shot, that one of these coronal mass ejections is really huge. You get what's called an extreme geomagnetic disturbance in the planet, a GMD, geomagnetic disturbance, extreme. Now, the last one happened in 1921. Now, in 1921, when it happened, lit up the sky incredibly from the North Pole all the way south to Haiti and Hawaii, and from the South Pole all the way far north to Samoa for 2 days and nights. I mean, incredible light show. Burned down some radio stations, burned down some telegraphs, burned down Penn Central Station, set some wires and light poles on fire, but not that big of a deal because this was in the days when there was no grid. There was just individual electrified cities. There was no nuclear power plants. There was no internet. And, if power went down for a while, then the world went around just fine. Well, if it happened today, the same storm as 1921, or an even bigger one 60 years earlier in 1859, called the Carrington event, it would fry these massive power transformers that our modern grid is totally dependent on. Now, we started installing these in the late 60s, finished off in the 90s upgrading our grid. Well, it turns out these transformers, they're really great and efficient and work wonderful. Well, they get cooked by a massive solar storm. And so what would it do? Well, you'd go out and you'd see the most incredible light show you've never seen before in your life. And most people alive today have never seen before in their life. And the grid would go down. There'd be no radio transmissions, there'd be no nothing. Well, the problem is that when the grid goes down, nuclear power stations automatically disconnect themselves from the grid and go to emergency shutdown. Now, when Fukushima blew its top a few months, about a year ago, it did that. According to Japanese authorities, it was not the earthquake directly that caused Fukushima to fail and melt down. The earthquake dropped the grid. When the grid dropped, Fukushima went into emergency shutdown, and backup generators and battery packs kicked in to keep the massive pumps flowing, to keep the cooling systems going. So you got like millions of watts of energy inside nuclear reactors.
Pardon the interruption, but I can see where you're going with this. We know that it's going to blow transformers. We're talking about the solar flares, and it's bad enough to have years of power outages and problems with infrastructure damage, but you're talking about the reactors. You're getting to the reactors,
right?
And that's the real the real threat that we're facing right now. Am I correct?
So we're talking both massive power failure, starvation, internet down, stock market crash, but on top of that, you're talking nuclear Armageddon.
Yeah.
Now, it's a good news, bad news story. What it means is that officially, these nuclear power plants have to have 1 week of fuel on hand. And the assumption is the grid in America is always stable and it always comes up within a few days and it's not a problem. Or if it is a problem, they can bring a diesel truck with extra fuel. Well, if you're talking a situation like 100 Katrinas happen at once, the whole country's in chaos, Can you imagine how poorly we did with Katrina? Now talk about 100 times over. Are we going to make sure that these diesel fuel trucks show up at every nuclear power plant, 104 in America, roughly 440 in the world, and keep these things running for perhaps years while they're getting the grid going, or certainly for months? Problem is they're going to melt down. Many of them are going to fail and melt down long before we get the grid repaired.
And so there's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide. And we were, literally surrounded by these things. And I read where you said that more than a third, 37% of the population live within 50 miles of a nuclear reactor. So we also know that they're built on the coastline. 75% of the population lives on the coast. So
right. Where our massive population centers are is where our nuclear power plants are, somewhere nearby. Yeah. Not, far enough. They're supposedly safe, but like Indian Point, north of New York City, filled with plutonium, if that place fries, it'll be, multiple generations before you can inhabit New York City again. And it'll be like that all up and down the East Coast. Now, here's the kicker. For a simple price of a stealth bomber, B-2 bomber, $2 billion, we could fix the problem. Now, we cannot prevent all bad things from happening, from a major solar storm or from a terrorist EMP. But for $2 billion, we could implement the fixes on the grid so the grid won't be fried, and we could implement backup parts and backup fuel and backup systems at each nuclear power plant to guarantee at least, there's nothing foolproof, but to try and prevent the massive nuclear Armageddon I'm talking about. So right now, we're looking at a situation that's 100% guaranteed to happen the way the world is wired today. And because these nuclear storms, these solar storms happen, they're a fact of nature, and they happen every average 70, 100 years. So the last one was 90 years ago. The one before that was 60 years. So do the math. It's going to happen. And we're either going to pretend that it's not going to happen like they did, with New Orleans, the Army Corps of Engineers knew for 70 years that we needed to fix those dikes, those levees, that it was a disaster waiting to happen. It wasn't a question of if, but when. And they had plans, and they even approved the money, but the money got spent on other things. So we're in that situation now where the engineers and the scientists know this is not an if, but when. Now, and they know how to fix it.
Before you joined us, we watched a quick video, and we learned about the different classifications according to strength. The B class being the smallest class of solar flare, X being the largest. How big of an X class are you expecting? How many, how often, and how long will the danger last? What are the most credible predictions? What is the solar flare forecast for 2012?
Well, the solar flare forecast is that every 11 years, the sun's pole flips. And when it does that, you have what's called a solar maximum, which is a period of extra intensity. Now, it looks like from the preliminary solar storms we've already seen, the flip of the pole is roughly around the end of 2012, Mayan calendar, all that stuff. I don't believe particularly in a random number that is predicting the end of the world, but they do tend to coincide, those two together. So scientists are very concerned that there's a significant chance that this solar maximum will end up being like the 1921 extreme event or the 1859 Carrington event, and nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. But I will tell you, in 2003, we had a fairly extreme X-class solar flare, and it converged down in South Africa, and it cooked 14 of those transformers. Now, that flare was less than 1/10 the strength of the event in 1921, which is 50% weaker than the 1859 event. So if that one happened and it screwed up the grid for over a year in South Africa, they had to have rolling blackouts throughout the country because only 14 of these big transformers cooked. They're multi-million dollars. They take a 3-year waiting list to get a single one right now. So if we're talking 350 in America alone and 2,000 worldwide if we had an event like the 1921. And that's in an official study from Meditech under the auspices of the Oak Ridge National Labs and double-checked by Sandia National Labs. So these are like some of the smartest brains in the world working on this problem, and they're saying this is real.
Well, then that brings us to, the last chapter of your book, When Disaster Strikes, The Unthinkable, Surviving a Nuclear Disaster. Could you go, I know you can't go into detail, but could you tell us a little bit about the 3 separate strategies, depending on the type of nuclear meltdown, I know you talked about a dirty bomb, an actual nuclear bomb attack, or in this case, the solar flares and a nuclear meltdown. Could you go into that chapter for us?
Okay. There are three different events, like you mentioned, and the strategies are different for each one. So let's start with the worst one, which is the solar flare and the meltdown. Now, a meltdown could happen for any God-known reason. I mean, 3 Mile Island, the skies are blue, you know, there was no earthquake, it just happened. It was an anomaly and it happened. So it could happen near you, and since 1/3 of us live in America, live within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant, the secret there is to figure out where the wind is, to know ahead of time where the plant is, to have your getaway plan, because you've got to get upstream, upwind of that power plant. And you want to make sure that you've got your air filtered so you're not breathing plutonium into your lungs in case there's air vented. You want to use not just a mask like they showed in the SARS epidemic. In the least, you want to have a painter's mask from, you know, Home Depot, Supply One, whatever. That's got the carbon canisters on it. It's kind of a poor man's gas mask. There's carbon filters that filter out about more than 95% of all particulate and also toxic gases in there. So they'll help you get through smoke. They'll help you get through things. They'll take most of that stuff out. You also want to make sure you filter all of your water. I use a good a filter must have a carbon block in it to suck out organic compounds, and it should have a microporous filter. Most of that nasty stuff will be stuck on particles large enough that a good bacterial filter will take it out. So you want to prevent it from, and you want to wash all of your food. You know, any food that you're getting anything off the ground, you want to wash it. You want to shake your clothing off, wash it if possible, and you need to get out of the downwind contaminated zone as soon as possible.
Well, you're also talking about you need, and every family needs this, you have to have a survival kit. You know, my family calls it, you know, grab and go bags. So what would you recommend for your basic grab and go survival kit?
Okay, now on my website, whentechfails.com, I've got all the details. So I'll give you a few of the top heavy hitters. You definitely want to have food, clothing, shelter, medicine for you and your family. A good first aid kit. My grab and go kit, I have a big blue tub that I keep my stuff in, and I keep large and small items. I also have a big box of all my camping gear, because I live in earthquake and wildfire country. And so here, if I had a big earthquake in the summer, bridges would go down, the gas lines would bust, a fire would start out. So I've got to be able to get out of the way of the ensuing firestorm. And if I can't get my four-wheel drive across the rivers, I'm going to have to do it on foot. So that's why I have my backpack. So I have a little compact first aid kit that's this big, palm of your hand. I supplement that. One of the most important items in your grab and go kit, 1.5-inch roll of cloth adhesive first aid tape. People say, why? Well, you can bind wounds with it, but more importantly, think about it. What do you see in a disaster? You see people walking down the roads. If it's a big disaster, they're not in their cars. There's no gas, the bridges are down, things aren't working. They're walking. And if people aren't used to walking, what happens? You blister up. When you blister up, your heels burst. You're not going anywhere. If you've got sore spots, you whip those shoes and socks off, take some of that tape off, the sticky side, you scrub it on your skin to get rid of the oils and the dirt and the scummy stuff, because it won't stick on a normal skin very well. Scrub that off, throw that piece of tape away, put some fresh tape on your heels, pop those shoes and socks back on, and you're back in business. I told this story to a real heavy-duty survivalist guy. He's got like 50 guns in his collection. He was interviewing me on a radio show. Actually, more like 75 guns. I mean, real gun nut. And he laughed and he said, you know, this is real embarrassing. He said, but I'll tell you this story. But I was in the Grand Canyon backpacking. You know, here I am, Mr. Tough Guy. I'm backpacking. I didn't have moleskin, which is really sticky stuff to stick on blisters. And I didn't have any of that tape you're talking about. And I blew my heels out. And they got raw and they were bleeding all over the place. They had to call a helicopter. Here I am, Mr. Hard Guy. They call a helicopter. Guy gets out of the helicopter and says, boy, you better have a credit card. And you better have a lot of credit left on it, because this is going to cost you. So most of us in a disaster cannot call that helicopter. Remember that 1.5-inch roll of cloth tape. You don't have that, duct tape will do, but you know, I'd rather have first aid tape on my skin than duct tape. I'm not sure what my reaction to duct tape is going to be, but anyway. So that's one item. Another item people don't think